This is the 10th generation iPad, Apple's latest iPad in their budget iPad lineup. It's got a whole new design change and an all new price tag too. Yeah, is it worth picking up? Let's find out with a little review. Out of the box, you get a USB-C to USB-C charging cable, a charging brick, and the iPad itself. The iPad takes on the design of the iPad Pro and iPad Air lineups with flat edges instead of curved edges and backs like the previous generation, and it removes the headphone jack along with this design change. But now it has both a landscape front-facing camera orientation, which no other iPad currently has, and smart connectors. The screen size and physical dimensions are very similar to the iPad Air. What sets this iPad apart though is a lower $450 starting price tag and the older A14 chip versus the M1 that's inside the iPad Air along with that $600 price tag. Beyond that, it has the details of basically every other iPad in this lineup now: a nice to look at Retina display, a singular 12 megapixel back camera, a fingerprint sensor on the top right, and speakers on the top and bottom of the iPad. There's now 5G support for the cellular model and a USB Type-C port for charging. Overall, the body got a much needed design update and is now consistent with the rest of the iPad lineup. Now let's talk about user experience. Using the iPad 10th generation is perfectly fine. Everything feels smooth when scrolling and in general everyday usage, and behaves exactly what you expect out of an iPad. The speakers sound decent, not as great as the iPad Pros, but this is half the price. The back cameras take decent pictures, and that's really all you need out of a tablet. With the front-facing camera now in landscape mode, it makes it easier to multitask while you're on a call, and works so much better when it's attached to a keyboard. Battery life isn't an issue, and it lasts as long as other iPads, and it passes the Genshin Impact test with flying colors, giving smooth gameplay even at medium settings, 60 frames per second. Though for this iPad, I'd rather play on low settings at 60 frames per second. I think most people who use this iPad will find that it will do most of the things they want out of their iPad perfectly fine. So when it comes down to being an iPad and doing iPad related things, it does the job and it does it well. Now, this review has been mostly positive, and it's been kind of vague because, well, this is a budget iPad. There's not much more to it than that. It does your iPad things, right? And when you look at this iPad in a vacuum, it is definitely a worthy upgrade from the 9th generation iPad. But this 10th generation iPad has a big issue that I think you should know about if you're considering this model. It costs more than the previous model at $450 instead of the last generation's $329. And honestly, it doesn't make a lot of sense in Apple's already large iPad lineup. That sounds a bit harsh, but let me tell you what I mean by that. Before this iPad, Apple had 4 main iPads. The basic iPad, which is a bare bones cheap iPad that serves most users just fine, and definitely caters more for the education market. Then you have the iPad Air that has some additional fancier features. You get a nicer display, better speakers, faster performance, and Apple Pencil 2 and Magic Keyboard support. Then there's the iPad Mini, which if you wanted all the features of the iPad Air, but in a more compact package. And lastly, the iPad Pro, which has all the bells and whistles at a much higher price tag. Whatever your own personal use cases are, you could easily point to any device in this lineup and figure out exactly what you wanted. This 10th generation iPad muddles the water and makes this lineup super confusing for the average person going out to buy an iPad for themselves. The iPad 9th generation is actually still being sold alongside this new 10th generation one. So while the 10th generation one is a replacement, the previous model is being sold with it. And it's honestly still a better value if you were just looking for an iPad for your kid, for their schoolwork, or a simple entertainment device for yourself. Then the iPad above it, the iPad Air, adds so much more functionality than the 10th generation iPad does that it makes the 10th generation iPad a bad value. Okay, hopefully I haven't lost anybody on this, but I'm gonna have to go into like a little history lesson. Let's go back 7 years. Apple released the original Apple Pencil back in 2015 alongside their first iPad Pro. The iPad Pro at the time had a Lightning port and looked very similar to what the 9th generation iPad does now. This 10th generation iPad only has support for the original Apple Pencil, and it's not a bad accessory, but it's a bad accessory with this particular iPad. See, because this iPad doesn't have a Lightning port like the iPads that first supported these did, when you want to charge the Apple Pencil one, you can't. It has a USB-C port, so you actually need an adapter to charge the Apple Pencil with this brand new iPad. While the older model, you can just plug it directly into the iPad, which of course even then was not intuitive, but much more simpler than it is now with the USB-C port on this iPad. So now there's more accessories for you to keep track of and little things for you to potentially misplace and instances where you may not be able to charge your Apple Pencil. Of course, in 2018, Apple addressed this by releasing a brand new iPad Pro with flat edges and the Apple Pencil 2 that attaches and charges magnetically with the flat-edged iPad Pro. So you can say the Apple Pencil 2 was designed specifically for these flat-edged iPads. And that's the case for the Pro, the Air, and the Mini. So it just baffles me that this iPad with flat edges and a USB Type-C port is released and Apple decided, yep, this only works with the original Apple Pencil. And oh yeah, it requires an adapter. And by the way, the latest version, which would in theory just attach magnetically to this iPad and charge it, it won't work with this. They purposely made their users' lives harder by releasing a product whose whole design was to be the perfect fit for this accessory and intentionally did not support it. And also, this kind of implies that this whole time it was possible for them to continue support for the Apple Pencil first generation for the iPad Air, an iPad Pro, and iPad Mini. They could have done that this whole time, but they didn't. This is not a good look for them, and it makes the entire lineup very confusing for their customers and puts them into a state of purchase paralysis. They do the same thing with their keyboards. They released a new keyboard specifically designed for this iPad that serves a very similar function as the Magic Keyboard does for the iPad Air and iPad Pro, but it only works for this new iPad. This 10th generation iPad actually shares very similar specs to the 2020 iPad Air, which, surprise, surprise, around this holiday season could be had for around the same price as the 10th generation iPad. And you get a better display and Apple Pencil 2 support. So basically what I'm trying to say is by purchasing this 10th generation iPad, you give up on either the great value you'd get by just buying the 9th generation with the older design, or the additional functionality and versatility you get with the iPad Air and its accessories. And instead, you get stuck in this weird hybrid in-between with an iPad that's new in some ways, but very old in others. So if you buy this iPad and buy an Apple Pencil 1 and ever wanted to upgrade from this iPad to like an iPad Air and an iPad Pro in 2 to 3 years, or maybe even a future 12th or 13th generation iPad, those will probably have Apple Pencil 2 support, and the accessories for this iPad may no longer work and you'll just have to buy new ones. So I think I made it pretty clear how I feel about this iPad, but I think that also leaves a big question mark about this device as a whole. If this iPad is so confusing and makes it difficult and muddies the water, who is this iPad for then? Like, what customer will look at this and see a perfect fit? Well, despite some of its compromises, I think there's still a market for an iPad like this. Call me crazy. It's for someone who wants an iPad that's nicer than the 9th generation iPad, but doesn't care much about using iPad accessories like Apple Pencils or keyboards. Because when you look past its spotty accessory compatibility, this is a nice upgrade that adds some much needed features such as stereo side speakers, a landscape camera, USB-C ports for charging, and a design refresh to modernize it. And if all that is good enough for you to personally purchase at the $450 price tag, then obviously feel free. I think most people's concern with it is that at $450, it's just too expensive. If it started at just a little higher than the 9th generation, like at around $370 and had the exact same specs as it does now, people wouldn't care that it doesn't have the latest Apple Pencil or keyboard support. So if those upgrades from the 9th generation and deficiencies from the Air make sense for you, it's still a good iPad. But could I at least recommend you shop around first? There may be some older 2020 iPad Airs that have slightly better accessory support still available for purchase. Anyway, what do you personally think? Does this iPad make sense for you? And in what way does it make sense? Are you considering a different iPad or, well, a different tablet altogether? I'd love to know your thoughts, so feel free to leave that in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and well, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Bye.